Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt, and I'm happy to welcome you back to the Center for Security Policy for our webinar series. To check the specifics of upcoming topics and speakers, please go to securefreedom.org, and I'll also give you a preview of upcoming events at the end of today's broadcast. Today's program, part of our continuing China series, is entitled Taiwan Invasion: How Would China Do It? To explore various scenarios, including some unconventional ones, we've reconvened two guests who joined us back in February, and we look forward to checking in now 4 months later on this evolving topic. Before proper introductions, let me remind you that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box in the GoToWebinar panel. I'll read as many questions as possible at the end of the program. The event is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, as well as our website, securefreedom.org. Well, yesterday, China reportedly flew a record 28 fighter jets toward Taiwan, the largest such display of force since Beijing began sending planes on a near daily basis last year. But conventional shows of force are just one of many strategies at China's disposal. A full-scale amphibious assault may be less desirable than, for example, stoking a domestic insurgency with limited direct involvement, or a sustained diplomatic and psychological gray zone attacks soften Taiwan's resolve. Our guests today are both senior fellows at the center. Joining us from Japan is Grant Newsham, a research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, focusing on Asia-Pacific defense, political, and economic matters. Newsham is a retired U.S. Marine colonel and was the first U.S. Marine liaison officer to the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force. He also served as research head of intelligence for Marine Forces Pacific and was the U.S. Marine Attaché, U.S. Embassy Tokyo on 2 occasions. Mr. Newsham has worked with the Taiwan Marine Corps over the years and spent 2019 in Taiwan as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs Fellowship, researching Taiwan's defense and how to improve it. Welcome, Grant. Stephen Bryen is a leading expert in security strategy and technology. He's held senior positions in the Department of Defense on Capitol Hill and is the president of a large multinational defense and technology company. Dr. Bryen has 50 years of experience in government and industry. He has served as a senior staff director of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as a deputy undersecretary of defense for trade security policy, and as a commissioner of the U.S.-China Security Review Commission. And Steve, you've written in detail about an invasion strategy that involves conventional military forces, but perhaps strategically limited to minor islands controlled by Taiwan, rather than the island of Taiwan itself. Please explain why this might be a more desirable option for Beijing.
Okay, well, thank you for having me again. It's been a while since February, but we're still playing the same games out in the region, just more and more of the same. I was in Taiwan in 1996 in March when the Chinese all but started an invasion of the island. And it took about 2 weeks to get the Clinton administration to finally send some aircraft carrier task forces to the region and frighten off the Chinese from trying it. And everyone knows, it's clear that since then, China has been trying to, first of all, figure out how to overcome U.S. power, because I think that the real problem they have in dealing directly with Taiwan is the United States. And I think that's correct on their part. So I was trying to think, what would the Chinese try if they really want to do something and cause some damage to Taiwan, force a change of government perhaps, or at least force a negotiation, concessions that would look a lot like maybe the Hong Kong concessions, or even worse. And the thesis that I've come up with is that they necessarily won't attack directly Taiwan itself, but they will attack Taiwanese possessions. And the most famous one that is on the list is Kinmen, pronounced Jinmen in the Chinese pronunciation. And it's what the Americans called in the past Quemoy, which was the Portuguese name of the island. Kinmen is close, very close to the Chinese mainland. You can see the Chinese city of Xiamen just across the bay. So it's that close. And I'm going to show you a few pictures. which makes it a very inviting target. It's not heavily populated. It's 150,000 people, more or less, and only about 5,000 troops. Now, it's very well revetted. It's got underground caves and very strongly built artillery, but it's very old-fashioned too in the way it's defended. From the Chinese point of view, an attack on Kinmen probably wouldn't provoke a U.S. reaction, much like what happened in the South China Sea, where the U.S. did nothing, absolutely nothing. China grabbed the islands, even after an international court said they didn't own them. They grabbed the islands, they militarized them, they did it day in, day out. And the U.S. said this and that and the other thing, but that was it. Sailed a few ships here and there, but China got away with it 100%. And I think that precedent is something they must be thinking a lot about right now. By taking Jinmen from China would essentially close a historical chapter, and I'll tell you more about it in a bit, when Mao attacked the island in 1949 and lost. The Chinese invasion force was defeated. He thought it was possible to take it, but it failed. By having Jinmen, China could put an awful lot of pressure on Taiwan, and would, and may try to force a change in government to put a more friendly government. Try to test the proposition that the Taiwanese really don't want to fight. And if they're going to lose things and get squeezed, they may just decide it ain't worth it. And even if that didn't come about, they would still have Jinmen, and they could then militarize it just like they militarized the reefs and the islands in the South China Sea. So they would just add to their capability. Can we get the next slide, please? Adam. This is the Jinmen Quemoy islands. There's a number of them. There's Erdon, Dadan, very little ones, lesser Kinmen, and then the main island itself. Okay, the next slide. And that's the main town in Jinmen. It's a pleasant town. It's not very big, but that's what it looks like. You can see China, those mountains in the back, that's China. Okay, next slide. This is interesting. This is Siu, which is an islet. It's owned by Taiwan, and you can see at the bottom of this little rock pile the Taiwanese flag stuck in there, looking in the wrong direction, unfortunately. Should be facing the other way. And behind it is the city of Xiamen, the Chinese city. So you can see the proximity. There's no proximity at all. Next slide. And this is one of the smaller islands, Daodan. It's basically a very almost uninhabited place. Next one. And these are Taiwanese pilots with their home-built FCK-1 fighter, which is their domestic jet. Next slide. Okay, let's go back to history. 1949, Battle of Guningtao is a beach. If you can just go right to the next slide, please. Next, let's keep going. One more. Okay, this is what it looked like, the invasion in 1949. This tries to show you the Chinese troops coming in. Basically, what happened was that Mao thought that he could grab Jinmen and humiliate Chiang Kai-shek, who was in Taiwan, and essentially hope that the local forces there, which he was subsidizing, would crush the nationalists. They were called the Nationalist Army, the ROK today, ROC today. Unfortunately for the Chinese, the invasion didn't work out. They sent about 9,000 troops in on essentially two beaches, about an 8 or 9 mile stretch, right where you see those arrows in the diagram. Next slide, please.
You know, Steve, maybe let's go back just for 1 second to the showing
Previous
how,
slide, oh, to show where they're located.
yeah, it's so close to the
Yeah,
coast.
you can see Jinmen is just right up against China. In 1960, you may recall that President, actually neither one was president at that point. Kennedy and Nixon, I guess Nixon was vice president, and they were debating for the presidential election, where Kennedy said you couldn't defend Kinmen, and Nixon said you must. Both Kinmen and Matsu. Matsu's a rock pile. It's not worth really a discussion. But in any case, this just gives you a quick description of the battle. I'm not going to concentrate. I'll just go to the next slide, if you would be so kind. One more. Let's go another. One more. I'm going to skip all the details. I just want to point out that this was the main. There were 22 of these tanks that the nationalists had on Jinmen in 1949. And these tanks turned out, I mean, these are not great tanks, but it turns out they were extraordinarily effective. Even one of them that was stuck in the sand on the beach and couldn't move was still able to shoot invasion boats. These were wooden boats at the time. They're no longer wooden, but they were able to knock them out and do quite a lot of damage to the invading Chinese Communist forces. Next slide. And here's some of the prisoners that were taken by the nationalists. The original thought that Mao had, was that there weren't that many troops on Jinmen. Taiwan wouldn't be able to reinforce in time to stop the successful invasion. And he also believed, and by the way, I have a feeling they still believe it, that the Taiwanese wouldn't fight. He thought they would just throw their arms up in the air. It actually worked the other way around, where the Chinese troops were the ones throwing their arms up in the air, and the Taiwanese did fight and fought pretty hard. They killed 2,000, at least 2,000 troops from China in this invasion. Next slide. Okay. Should we do the film?
I think that may be it.
Okay.
Let's skip the film just for.
Okay. Let me just summarize that. So for historical reasons, it would seem to me that this would be attractive to the Chinese because it would right a wrong, if you want, to prove that Mao was just ahead of his time, because they could do this pretty easily, it would seem. It's far enough from Taiwan and it's because of the number of airplanes and missiles the Chinese could use. I mean, the Taiwanese would have a very great difficulty reinforcing Jinmen in a battle. But the real item here of most importance is, what would the United States do? And it's my contention that the United States would be caught in a very difficult position for two reasons. One is not much we could do. It's right against China. How are we going to do that? We're not ready for that sort of thing. We're not prepared. And I don't think we could even be prepared. So that's a huge problem, which would then give aid and comfort to the Chinese, who say, okay, well, why don't we do it? Would give us something to show our own people that we've been successful. We've shown these guys that we mean business. We're not going, this is our land and we want it back. It's time for the Taiwanese to sit down with us and make a deal and stop this independence stuff. And you know, and we're trapped. We're out of the game. So that's why I think it's, I mean, I don't like the right Chinese strategy, but and I'm not sure it is even their strategy, but but at least it has those merits, and we have to keep that in mind, and we have to think of countermeasures. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steve. I think that's illuminating, and I think just that visual alone of the photo as well as the map, I think not a lot of people are aware that Taiwanese possessions are that close to the mainland, and provides an interesting strategic problem. So Grant, you recently wrote really a fascinating paper for the center. You pointed to Russia's unconventional strategies in eastern Ukraine and how they might be applied to China with respect to Taiwan. Please give us a tour of potential similarities as well as differences. What might that actually look like if transferred to East Asia?
Sure, I'll be glad to. Now, when you hear the words China invades Taiwan, it conjures up a different image, I think, for most people. One of the common images is something like a D-Day or a full-scale assault of an Iwo Jima sort. That's always a possibility, and we'll get to that later. But there was another part that I wanted to consider, and that was given the Chinese preference for subversion, political warfare, could they have do something like Vladimir Putin did in the Ukraine, where he basically took over the eastern part of the country. If you could show the slide, please.
Oh.
And he took over a part that's called the Donbas region, and it's the very easternmost part. And what he did is he basically said, well, it's just unhappy locals who don't like the Ukrainian government. And as for these little green men in tanks, well, who knows where they came from? And so he got it through a combination of stealth, force, and a lot of chutzpah, which he's got plenty of. But Putin had some real advantages when he was doing this. One is he shares a land border with Ukraine with the Donbas region, so that makes it easier to operate. Also, in the local population, there was actually a lot of nostalgia for the Soviet era, largely owing to economic troubles that they had. There's also a large Russian-speaking population. And Putin also had fifth columnists throughout the Ukrainian government and the military, and he thought he was going to be able to get all the way to Kiev, way over in the west. To his great surprise, the Ukrainian defense coalesced, and he was stalled in the Donbas region. But he still got he still has that region. The government of Ukraine does not control it. And also, Putin had just before going into Donbas, he had seized Crimea down at the bottom of the slide from Ukraine. He had done that and gotten away with it. So what I was trying to think of is, could the Chinese try to do something like that with Taiwan, and particularly the island of Formosa, the main island, not the little ones that Stephen just talked about. So what are China's prospects for a Donbas sort of strategy? Well, as I said, they've got there's some troubles here. Partly, you don't have a land border. There's a 100-mile ocean that you have to get across. Additionally, Taiwan's a really big place. It's about 14,000 square miles. And if you've been to Hawaii, the big island of Hawaii, which is big, is only 4,000 square miles. But also, the Chinese timing is not very good. If they had tried it maybe 6 years ago or earlier, it would have been better for them. There's always been a lot of pro-China, pro-unification politicians in Taiwan. The president before the current one, President Ma, from 2008 to 2016, there's people that thought he actually wanted to engineer annexation with the PRC. And there were some real doubts as to whether or not he really wanted to defend Taiwan. Also, there's plenty of pro-PRC people in Taiwan's academia, in religious groups, even community organizations. The subversion has worked pretty well. Media, there's some just seem like Chinese mouthpieces. And in the business world, there's a lot of people who do business in China and are effectively pro-PRC. And even back then, even younger Taiwanese many of them saw the future as China. That was largely owing to a very weak Taiwanese economy, didn't look like there were prospects, thought they could get jobs in China. And also, there's always been no shortage of spies in Taiwan. So if Xi Jinping had played his hand better, he just might have had a sort of a better environment and an opening for a Donbas sort of approach. But he just couldn't help himself, sort of like a fat man at the buffet. He just can't stop. And what he did is he scared enough Taiwanese to the point that a Donbas got much harder. It'd be very hard to pull that off today. So what is the situation today? Well, there is, of course, a substantial fifth column in Taiwan. It's had decades to set it up, the Chinese have. And you think about it, and it's easy to put people in place, transport to and from Taiwan's easy. Also, moving hardware is not that difficult, and hardware can be communications equipment, explosives, weapons. That too, not very hard. There's well-established smuggling networks between Taiwan and the mainland. Organized crime has a big presence in Taiwan. A lot of that is pro-PRC. And there's even one Taiwanese port which has a reputation for being very friendly for that sort of activity. So there's a possibility that if called upon, this fifth column in Taiwan could go into action in support of a more conventional assault, sort of assassinations, attacking key targets, etc., and maybe even grabbing an airfield or a port or two, which would allow you to bring in, to flow in other forces. But a fifth column is one thing, and breaking down Taiwan government control of an area is another, and seizing control of that area and occupying it. That's a very different thing, and I don't think the Chinese could do that yet. The possibility of putting guerrillas up sort of into operation in Taiwan, say up in the mountains, that too would be problematic. They might survive for a little while, but it's a hard place to sustain yourself, and say the Taiwan Marine and Army reconnaissance recruit heavily from the indigenous populations, and they might enjoy the opportunity to practice and get some heads. Also, you just won't have the public support for it, particularly not among the younger Taiwanese, who really they've come to really have no interest in being dominated or controlled by the PRC. Among the older generation, they're less opposed, and there are some people who wouldn't mind unification, but being the old generation, there's less and less of them as time passes. It is really the Hong Kong experience in the last couple of years that really woke people up and turned more people in Taiwan just dead set against the idea of PRC unification. There are, of course, still plenty of pro-China politicians, some of them keeping quiet, most of them in the KMT, some are independent, and also in the media, there's still pro-Chinese factions, and also this lower level subversion that I mentioned still exists, academia as well, the business community. So there is something to work with, but it's not what it was 6-7 years ago. It's had to kind of lay low. So the DPP, the current ruling party, which does not want to be part of China, is in the ascendancy. So I would say that a long-term, slow-moving occupation of the Donbas sort is unlikely. And just geography works against it, the state of the population works against it as well, and political conditions are unfavorable. And there's really no part of Formosa where there's such opposition to the Taiwan state, to the government, that would allow them to establish a no-go zone. And also the Taiwanese police and the military is still able to sort of hammer anyone who tries to do that. So at most, I would say that for now, a short-term control of a small area, say a port or an airfield in particular, to support a larger amphibious and multi-pronged assault, that is probably feasible, but not a sort of a Donbas sort of effort of the sort that Putin would recognize. As for the offshore islands, that would be a little easier. In some cases, there's some local affinity for the PRC, and historical ties, and there may be something to work with. Just concoct a provocation. Just say the locals invited us, or take advantage of a typhoon that comes through, saying we're just coming to help for humanitarian reasons. That's a possibility. But I think if China does that, they've showed their hand. And that just might stiffen spines elsewhere in Taiwan, but also in the region and around the world. And so China could face some other pressure if it were to do that. But as for future prospects of a Donbas in Taiwan, it's always worth remembering that circumstances change. Just the political situations change, the way people think changes, and often it happens pretty quickly. And so if the PRC could create economic turmoil, psychological intimidation, create a sense of hopelessness, fear, etc., and weaken the will to resist, and then combine that with military encroachments of the sort we see all the time, then it may have a more favorable environment. Also, there's always a possibility of sort of using Chinese maritime militia and the fishing fleet to create almost a Donbas at sea. You just swarm places close to Taiwan with enough ships, maritime militia, and maybe even put people ashore at some point and tell Taiwan to stand clear. That is a scenario. And you do all, if you can do this, if China could do this with a different, more pliable government, not today's government, but with a different one, well, they just might acquiesce into what China would try to do. And in the future, not right now, it is possible. Some analysts say that a coalition of pro-PRC officials, KMT members, pro-PRC academics, business leaders, United Front people, just might call for the PRC to enter Taiwan under, say, the guise of HADR or something else. Or even worse, elections do turn out differently than you think, and if a CCP, a Chinese puppet, were to be voted in, that would be very, very serious. That almost happened in 2020 when Han Kuo-yu, the KMT, had a shot at winning. And also, if the military continues to stay weak and a little bit demoralized, that creates a favorable environment. The lack of a decent reserve force, the lack of a civil defense operation as well, it creates a sense of hopelessness or isolation, and that too is problematic. But that is how things could develop in the future that might make a Donbas realistic. But so you have to be careful. But ultimately, it comes down to the question, I think, of is Taiwan going to be left to fend for itself? And all that tracks back to Washington, D.C. For now, it seems that Taiwan does have American support, and that does have a bracing effect inside Taiwan. And also a Donbas response, a response to something like a Donbas, would be a little bit easier for the U.S. With Taiwan than it was with Ukraine. Most people in the American foreign policy community didn't know much about Ukraine, and they do about Taiwan. Also, America has bases in the area and has been operating there for a long time. But I would say that if the United States is distracted, disinterested, frightened, or if it allows the military imbalance to develop such that the American military cannot move to support Taiwan without getting slaughtered or hit very hard to the point that we just can't move, that would change the entire dynamic. And then you might see the PRC is more willing to aggressively coerce Taiwan, ruin the economy, terrorize and demoralize the public, and beef up its fifth column and sympathizers and put them to work. And at that point, you just might see a Donbas become more feasible. But for now, I think it would be a long shot for the Chinese. But in the future, you have to be careful. There.
Grant, thank you so much. I hope the audience agrees that it's fascinating and also something that's not being examined, definitely not in the general public discourse. And although your final assessment is that it wouldn't be successful, I think from what you described, some elements of it would be present in a conventional operation as well. So it's just very important to examine. So speaking of that, let's look briefly, maybe some quick takes on what the full-scale amphibious assault would look like and would it be successful. The U.S. Navy War College just came out with an assessment, and generally speaking, the majority said no, China is not able to mount an amphibious assault at this time. But what does that exactly mean, and what would the goals be? First, Steve, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, we've had a number of war games, and run by the Bryen Corporation, by the Air Force, by the Marines, and others to try and understand what the situation would look like, especially if we tried to help out. And most of those assessments are very negative to the U.S. and to Taiwan, that the Chinese have preponderance of force, and if they really meant to use it, they could. So I think what really is important is what the Chinese think. Are they convinced they can do it? And are they convinced the U.S. won't get involved and then we end up in World War III? I mean, are they convinced about that and they want to risk it? Is it really worth it to them? Or can they take some shorter term? The problem is, that this constant harassment of Taiwan has its natural upper limit, not only because you have to decide what you want to do or not do, but you're basically drumming up support for an invasion in the country in China. You're talking to people, you say, we're strong, we can do this. It's a very dangerous kind of mood, which leaves them have to do something, because if they don't do something, the government will be humiliated. That's the kind of problem you're getting toward. And this has been going on for, I don't know how long, maybe Grant knows, quite a long time. And it's building up, now it's 28 airplanes, fighter planes and some bombers crossing over the air defense identification zone into Taiwan's airspace, causing them to scramble their jets, raising tensions. And then a point I would make that I believe is true, and if you recall, I was talking earlier between us about the Hainan Institute incident in 2007, when the Chinese jets attacked an E-3A.
2001.
2001. You're right. Yeah. Sorry. Time goes fast. And so the plane was forced to land on Hainan Island. The Chinese impounded it, arrested our soldiers, and it was a very nasty business. But what was interesting about it, and I recall very clearly, is there was the impression here that this show was being run by the Chinese military, not by the civilian government. And in fact, the civilian government seemed to be ignorant of a lot of what was going on. So, how preponderant is the Chinese military? How far can they go and get away with it? These are unknown. We don't know the answer, but it's dangerous. It's extremely dangerous, because this is a very, this is a government we really have very little insight into, and in the military where we have even less. And so we're always relying on intelligence and other things, which is what it is, not awfully good. So the chance for a surprise, or for someone to go further, or to launch some missiles, or God knows what, all of that's very, very present. And as tensions rise, that becomes more likely, because that's what happens when tensions rise. You have to have a way to let the pressure off, or everything will go bang. I think the Chinese are going to be under a lot of pressure, because they're creating it. Unless they back down, which I would urge, and I think our government should urge them, in the strongest possible terms. Cut it out. Pull those planes back. We don't want to see them crossing into the ADIZ anymore. If you do, we're going to meet them with U.S. aircraft. Pull them back. Stop it now before it gets out of hand. That's what I would advise.
And it seems that your view there is the prevalent one, which is that we would be on the back foot. And thank you for fleshing it out on many angles of it. But then, Grant, I'm wondering, and you can comment in any way you wish, but also, do you have anything to say about the War College opinion and why it was what it was?
Well, there were minority opinions, and I would have been in the minority of this. It is what it is. But the question of conventional assault on Taiwan, that large-scale attack, which has an amphibious component, is an interesting one, not to say the least. But the basic, and I found that it's thinking through it, I reached certain conclusions. And the basic problem, of course, is to get across the strait by sea and or air, get a foothold, and force the Taiwan government to give up. And the question is, could China do it? Are they willing to do it? I think they probably are, if they have to. I can't get Taiwan to submit otherwise, but could they do it? And that's where the analysts will differ. One of the principal arguments that you hear all the time is that, well, China lacks lift. And lift refers to enough ships and aircraft to get you across the strait. And I don't understand the calculations there because it's got plenty of ships, plenty of aircraft. I would cite that they've got 55 amphibious ships, for example. Some of them are old ones, but old ones work as well as new ones. And unlike us, the Chinese can build them for less than $2 billion a piece. They've got literally thousands of ferries, container ships, roll-on, roll-off vessels, barges, and by 2030, they're going to have even more of these. So they've got plenty of lift if you include the Chinese civilian capabilities, and those things work very well. You've just got to get across the strait once. But if you're just counting on military frontline or the most new amphibious ships, well, maybe they don't have enough, but you don't need them. And the Chinese have shown themselves willing to improvise and use whatever's at hand and use it effectively. Also, the Chinese military trains to incorporate civilian resources. They're constantly exercising this in China and also on a fairly large scale. So I would say that with the right weather, sea conditions, and cover, and I'll describe cover later, that they could probably get a few tens of thousands of troops ashore in a day, that maybe 3 army divisions and a Marine brigade, roughly. Additionally, you throw in your airborne capabilities, and that's dropping paratroopers. They can do that, and they're getting better at it in terms of capability and scale. They've been training for this mission in one way or another for 50 years now. They're working on their joint capabilities, the ability to combine air, sea, and ground units. And that's one of the criticisms or one of the weaknesses pointed out by a lot of analysts is they don't do joint operations well. They're not good enough to do it in a large-scale assault on Taiwan. Maybe not, but I'm not so sure about that. They may not be fully trained to the way we would do it, but sometimes you've just got to be good enough. Look at the Argentinians in the Falklands. The British outclassed them in every single respect, and the Argentinians almost won. And unfortunately, the Chinese are not Argentinians. But there's always been a sort of condescension. I've noticed over the years when Americans assess Chinese capabilities for this sort of an operation, it's almost as if, well, they'll never be our equals or able to master these skills, that it's just too hard. And I think that's a dangerous position to have. If you look at how fast China has brought on capabilities that experts said would take them at least a decade more to get. Aircraft carriers come to mind, but they always do things faster and better than have been planned. It's not saying they don't have problems and a boatload of them, but it's good not to underestimate them. And I tend to err on the sort of giving them the benefit of the doubt. So would they come across a beach or come by air or seize a port or an airfield? Probably some of each. Nobody quite knows. If an attack does happen, there will be one guy who figured it out perfectly, and the other 99 analysts will all be kind of wrong, but the one guy will be dining out for free for the rest of his life. Also, there's one of the weaknesses pointed out by the War College was that the Chinese don't have proper logistics for an amphibious assault. Well, if it's logistics of the American kind, maybe not. But sometimes, once again, you just have to be good enough. And if you look at Chinese capabilities for logistics operations in their civilian world, I'm not so sure that I would sort of downplay what the military can do logistics-wise. In fact, one of the comments in the summary of the War College report was that some people said that because they say until China can master joint logistics over the shore, which is a phrase for the U.S. military, until they can master that, they can't invade Taiwan. I'm not so sure I'd count on that. Will we have advance notice of a conventional assault on Taiwan, a large scale one? I would say not necessarily. We've always thought that it'll be like D-Day or the Germans trying to invade England, where you could see the barges in the ports. But I'm not so sure that the Chinese will not be able to get things positioned using their greatly improved rail, air, ship, port infrastructures in eastern China, get it positioned to the point where they could actually go without notice or without us catching it. And even I think DOD says that they could probably do it for the smaller islands without advance notice. So once again, I'm concerned about that. And I mentioned cover, because when you think of an assault on Taiwan in terms of how they would do it, it's not just going to be boats and barges coming ashore with some ships offshore lobbing shells in, but it's going to take place in a much different, more severe context, and that is going to be missile assaults, just a hailstorm of missiles hitting targets in Taiwan. Fifth columnists will be activated. Special forces probably be operating, causing trouble. Airborne drops, cyber attacks, electronic warfare, communications and satellite links will be cut. It's going to be UAV and UAV swarms. The public's going to be targeted. There's going to be huge chaos. Electricity, communications, food, water, all of it out. And then, so that's your context. And the Chinese Air Force will be swarming. The Chinese Navy is going to be all over the place. And then you have the question of U.S. intervention. You've got F-26 missiles that could maybe sink an aircraft carrier on its way. Well, that causes you some problems. So that's when there's a lot of things that go into the possibility of a conventional assault on Taiwan, and the Chinese have systematically gone about trying to master them. And the debate is, have they mastered them enough? It is something that needs to be taken very seriously. And I would tend to think that they just might think that it's worth it, that they have the capability to do it, and the payoff, from a Chinese perspective, just might be just so tempting. When you think about it, is seize Taiwan, and what message is that sent to every country in the region and the world? It's one that, well, the Americans couldn't stop us, not the U.S. military, not economic or financial threats, not even nuclear weapons. So what chance has anyone else got? Additionally, you seized key terrain in the middle of the first island chain, and you can operate outwards with relative ease from that point. So that's, so you throw this into the mix, and the idea of a conventional assault backed up by all these other activities to cause mayhem, that along with the psychological aspect of it all, that it is something that I would take very seriously, and like the PACOM commanders have said, I think that it is something that needs to be considered in the fairly near future, and steps taken to make sure that it doesn't happen. So that's if they had invited me to the War College game, that's what I would have told them.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And with that, we are just about at question time. So let's go to the audience, and there's some interesting ones. So, Steve, you mentioned the China building itself up, and then inevitably they'd kind of have to follow through. And then, of course, Grant's was about a fifth column. This question is, let's say the Chinese invasion fails. What about those consequences if they do it before they're ready? And number two, what about their fifth column, or what about their domestic troubles if they fail? Steve, let's start with you.
We don't know. The one good news in China is the Chinese Communist Party controls the press. It controls all information. It controls social media. It controls social media, internet. So the question is how the public would react. Maybe they'll react. They want China to use nuclear force against Taiwan. Who knows? I mean, it's a very volatile situation. And I think what's missing in the equation, I tried to get at when I was putting what I would do thesis on the table, is we have to give them some real warnings. And we have to show them that right now the jury is still out on what the U.S. might do. What will Biden do? What would Trump have done? The jury is really out. And I think we have to show them that we will do. Just sailing the ship through the Taiwan Straits does, the Chinese complain about it, but it's not actually much of a threat. But when you tell them we're going to put our Air Force up, if they cross into Taiwan's airspace again, and we're going to face us just as much as the Taiwanese jets, then you got a different game. Very different game.
Well,
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
ahead.
Yeah.
I would say that if you keep backing off, and the other side thinks that you're not, at the end of the day, you're not going to fight. You've got some problems, and that's a lesson that most people learn by about the age of 5 in the schoolyard. In terms of what the response of the Chinese public would be to an assault that doesn't go well, those things are always hard to gauge, as Stephen said, though I think one might suggest that in the initial phase, there would be a sort of a rallying of support, sort of this outpouring of patriotism. And once your people start getting killed, then there's sometimes a tendency to say, well, let's really go get them now. And then as some time passes, though, the butcher's bill gets bigger and bigger. Then people start to turn sometimes against the regime that has got them into this mess, particularly if they're starting to suffer. Once again, the Falklands is such a fascinating example. It's small, of course, but there are some things that are worth looking at in that regard. But also, if China does invade or attack Taiwan, I would say even in the offshore islands, but particularly against Formosa, I think they would see that all of their international trade stops, except with North Korea and maybe or what they can send overland to Iran. They have to weigh that into account. This entire trading network that they have got in place, it's going to stop. Additionally, they could find themselves cut off from the U.S. dollar system, and the U.S. dollar is still not for much longer, but it's still got some time. And without that foreign exchange, China has the equivalent of Confederate money, and that puts them in another problem, in another serious position as well. They've got to feed their people. And also, if they do, say, attack Taiwan, it's going to even convince the quislings that you find in the U.S. and Europe, who would really sell out their birthright for a slice of Chinese cash. Even a lot of them are going to have to say, look, this is enough. So there's some ripple effects of an attack on Taiwan that it will feel anyway. And if it's not a successful attack, it just gets even worse. So that is hopefully one.
Or a prolonged attack.
Yeah, hopefully that's something that Beijing is considering, and hopefully it's something that we realize that we have a good hand to play if we choose to play it.
I think this is something you might have brought up on the last time we were here, Steve, but it's questioning about the chip supply chain. What if what if Taiwan's dominance diminishes in the chip supply chain? Would that create a political environment better for the PRC?
Won't make the high-tech industry in California happy. Won't make the car industry happy either, because they need the chips for the computers for the cars, these and sensors, all that stuff. So it will have an economic, for sure have an economic impact. Some of the Taiwan Semi, which is the biggest company in Taiwan and the most important one we rely a lot on, is setting up some plants in the U.S. So never too late. And people are going to have to decide where they want to be in 20 years. And it would be good if our government encourages Taiwanese industry, including its defense industry. I've advocated that for a long time, to become our partner and to be present in the United States and to manufacture in the United States, defense and the commercial. Today, dual use is, technology, electronics, especially, but not only, materials as well, is a very important area for economic survival and military. So that would be my thought.
Grant, you're in Japan. There's a simple question here. Where is Japan in all of this?
They're watching to see what the Americans do. They absolutely refuse to take the initiative. There are some Japanese, I think Vice Defense Minister Nakayama, who would I think he knows that Japan ought to be doing more, but they wait to see what America does, and then they try to figure out what the minimum they have to do is, and then do a little less. No, I'm joking about that. This is what comes of 30 years of resentment. But no, Japan knows that it's got a problem with Taiwan if if Taiwan comes under Chinese control, because one, Japan will be brought into an attack on Taiwan, and if not, Japan will be next. So they know this. But they are, as I say, following to see, they're looking to see what America is going to do. And if America decides that it is going to actually support Taiwan, defend it, that you'll find the Japanese come along. I think that they won't do it on their own initiative, but they'll wait to see what we do. And then I think that you'll see that Japan might give us a pretty nice support. They have some very good niche capabilities in the anti-submarine warfare, just undersea warfare, and their navy's very good. The rest of their military needs improvement, and if we insist that they do, they probably will. But they're waiting to see what we do, and but they definitely know that adage, Taiwan's defense is Japan's defense. That's true, but they need to do more. Despite the Biden summit, the Biden-Suga summit, where they talked about Taiwan, they didn't really require the Japanese to do anything in particular. So that remains to be accomplished.
What are your thoughts on cyber, bioweapons, and subversion as the new conventional, meaning we won't see large-scale military operations? So, Grant, you already talked about subversion. Anyone about cyber or bioweapons?
Well, the Chinese have been hitting the Taiwanese for a long time with cyber attacks of all kinds, both trying to steal information, destroy the critical infrastructure, disrupt power supply, hit their banking system. They're doing all that. Nothing that says the Taiwanese can't do it to the Chinese. And if I were them, I'd be working hard on that. I mean, tit for tat. There's a lot more targets in China than there are in Taiwan.
Yeah, I think that the conventional warfare, is never going to go away. At the end of the day, you've got to have that ability to actually physically coerce somebody if they don't surrender. And so I don't think it's a bio-warfare, cyber attacks. It really makes life miserable for people, but it may not be enough to get them to submit to your will. And that is sometimes does require what we'd call a regular military to do it. That would be my sense of it.
Here's an interesting question or suggestion. What value would you place in having the U.S. Navy prepared to seize China's instant islands in the South China Sea as a counterbalance?
Why?
Why? Okay.
I think they indeed have I have an opinion. But,
Sure.
Well, my opinion is just that would be too far away from the action, and it wouldn't be very meaningful.
Yeah, I would prefer. There's probably other things you could do. I would say, sink 300 of Costco's big transport ships, or close down the Chinese port where they're operating around the world. That would probably be something better to do, more effective. And also, once again, the U.S. dollar is still the one big club that we've got to wield, and that is perhaps where I would apply the pressure. But I understand the argument. I'm not so sure the Chinese would miss those islands very much, and sort of hanging on to them would be some effort. But I would probably apply pressure elsewhere, were it me.
Let's just do like a lightning round on the way these two entities would respond. We have about 2 minutes. So how would Russia respond and how would NATO respond? Let's start with Steve.
NATO wouldn't do anything. It's not their fight. It's not covered by NATO treaty. It has nothing to do with NATO. Russia, I think the Russians would wait and see what happened. I mean, because from the Russian point of view, the Russians are never sure where they are with China. You can argue, and I think we should be arguing, that there are more reasons geopolitically for us to try and work out some deals with the Russians to balance the Chinese than it is to let the Russians and Chinese team. But I think from the Russian point of view, the same is true. I mean, they're going to watch. They're going to watch. They're not going to intervene.
And Grant, did you have any?
Well, I would agree on that. I think for the Russians, this would be, or Putin in particular, this would be a win-win if there ever was one, to have the Chinese and the Americans at each other's throat.
Right.
I would expect North Korea to maybe do something at China's behest to complicate things for us, and would part of it. NATO, Stephen's probably at the end of the day right. I don't think they have much to do, but at the same time, you never know when, sort of decent people will speak up, and maybe they would go along with sanctions or something. But in terms of a sort of a military support role that they could play, it's hard to know exactly who would do that.
I'm reminded that when the Italians supported us in Afghanistan, they made sure their airplanes didn't have any guns or ammunition.
Yeah, but once again, it all depends on the nature of the fight. If it is something that is just ghastly and on the front, it's the sort of front page news every single day. Sometimes that changes thinking, and you may find NATO sort of standing up on its hind legs, and the Europeans more than they would otherwise. But if it's something that you can ignore or rationalize, humans are pretty good at that. Be my take.
We'll have to close it out there. Thank you so much, Grant Newsham and Stephen Bryen, for joining us today. Just some quick announcements. Next Thursday, June 24th, we have a very special guest. Unfortunately, I can't say who it is, so we're just going to tease that. But if you heard about this event, you'll get a mailing on that. The following Wednesday, June 30th at 1 p.m., we're welcoming author Robert Spencer, who will discuss his new book, Islamophobia and the War on Free Speech. That'll be moderated by the Center's Kyle Scheidler. Well, we certainly enjoyed having you here today. Remember, the Center's thought-provoking events like today's are only possible because of your generous support. If you did enjoy it as much as I did, please consider visiting our website at securefreedom.org, clicking on the big white donate button in the upper right corner, where you can make an instant contribution by credit card or get information about other methods of giving. Thanks again to our guests. We'll see everyone next week. Thanks very much.